Faithfully delivering value, interpreting great books worldwide. Hello, this is Sally Book Talks. Today we'll be discussing the book, The Third Reich at War, written by renowned British historian Richard J. Evans, an expert in German history. The Third Reich refers to the German Third Reich, commonly known as Nazi Germany. Though titled The Third Reich at War, the author focuses less on battles and more on how Nazi ideology shaped Germany's political operations during that period. During War II, Nazi Germany controlled most of Europe, establishing a new European order. From its rise to fall, this order was driven by one core ideology: racism, which brought catastrophic suffering to humanity. To this day, Nazi Germany and its racist ideology remain among humanity's most painful historical lessons. I'll explore wartime Nazi Germany and its racism across 2 episodes. This first part examines how Nazi Germany used racism to shape Europe's new order. On September 1st, 1939, Germany's Blitzkrieg on Poland ignited World War II. Over the next 2 years, Germany achieved consecutive military victories. By October 1941, before attacking Moscow, Germany controlled most of Europe through occupation, puppet states, and alliances, creating a German-serving new order. This encompassed political, economic, and ideological dimensions, with racism at its core. The racist order had 4 components. First, dismembering Poland. Second, colonizing Eastern Europe via General Plan Ost. Third, exterminating Jewish people. Fourth, systematically executing disabled Germans. Let's examine each component separately. First, dismembering Poland. In the late 19th century, German geographer Friedrich Ratzel proposed Lebensraum theory. He viewed nations as living organisms requiring growth space, just like biological life. Thus, territorial expansion for Lebensraum was seen as inevitable for national survival. Long before World War II, the Nazis advocated creating Lebensraum for Germans in Eastern Europe. After occupying Poland in October 1939, Hitler moved to implement this vision. He divided Polish territory into 2 parts. The West was directly annexed to Germany to resettle newly arrived German immigrants. The East formed the General Government of Poland to house Polish people. Hitler's goal was to establish a new racial order in Poland. This was Nazi Germany's first comprehensive implementation of racist ideology. To achieve this goal, Germany introduced 4 measures to completely dismantle Polish society. These 4 measures were the expulsion campaign, purging the elite, indiscriminate killing of civilians, and plundering property. First, let's look at the expulsion campaign, which occurred in the annexed German part. In the winter of 1939, Germany began forcibly expelling Poles from this region to the General Government of Poland. The vacated land was then given to German immigrants, and the expelled Poles faced extremely miserable conditions. They were brutally crammed into train cars by German soldiers during the harsh winter, without sufficient warm clothing or food. In December 1939, after a train transporting Poles reached its destination, officials unloading it found 40 children's corpses. They had all frozen to death inside the train cars. By early 1941, when Germany halted large-scale expulsions, over 1 million people had been expelled. These Poles lost their homes and property, but received no compensation. Even if they survived the expulsions and reached the general government, Poles still faced endless killings and plundering. The second measure to dismantle Poland, purging the elite. Long before the war, Nazi leaders compiled a list of 60,000 Polish experts, intellectuals, politicians, and supporters of Polish sovereignty. Hitler planned to eliminate these Polish elites to permanently eliminate any threat. Of course, the targets of German massacres included not only elites, but also anyone perceived as a threat to German rule. As for how to judge if someone posed a threat, it was entirely up to the Germans' arbitrary decisions. Thus came the third measure to dismantle Poland: indiscriminate killing of Polish civilians. In 1939, A drunken farmer in Wawr, Poland, argued with German soldiers and stabbed one, which was deemed a threat to Germany. The Germans then retaliated brutally, killing 122 villagers in Wawr. They also thought the villagers were too few, not reaching the planned massacre quota, so they stopped a train at the local station and killed several passengers on the spot. Among them, 3 bodies were hung upside down at the station for 4 days, with a huge sign next to them explaining the reason for the massacre.
And they warned that if any German was killed or injured, this would be the consequence.
The fourth measure in Poland was property plundering. In September and October 1939, Germany repeatedly ordered the comprehensive confiscation of all property belonging to Poles and Jews in the occupied areas. In 1940, Germany established the Eastern Trust Agency to manage enterprises confiscated from Poland, legitimizing the plundering. By June 1941, in occupied Poland, 50% of commercial institutions and 1/3 of large estates had been expropriated by Germany without compensation. Even experimental equipment from university labs and animal specimens from Warsaw Zoo were not spared. Under Germany's violent destruction, Polish society rapidly disintegrated. In the general government of Poland, the black market thrived. Food was scarce, and bandits who killed, robbed, and raped women were rampant in the countryside. Among Poles, informing on each other became common, prostitution among women was rampant, and more Poles turned to drunken brawling. As one Polish doctor said, Polish morale was so low, completely devoid of national pride, and such a depraved hell on earth was a product of Nazi racist policies. Hitler explicitly stated that Poland was a place of intense ethnic struggle, where such struggle allowed no legal constraints, and its methods contradicted universal principles. He even demanded that the chaos in Poland must be allowed to continue. However, dismantling Poland was only the first step for Hitler to establish a racist order there. His ultimate goal was to make Poland a habitat for Germans. So it happened almost simultaneously. At the same time, Germany began the Germanization of occupied Poland. So-called Germanization actually meant making it German, encompassing both racial and cultural aspects. First, looking at racial Germanization. After occupying Poland, the SS began conducting racial screening within Poland. This screening targeted 2 groups. One was ethnic German immigrants who responded to Hitler's call and returned from Eastern Europe, numbering about 1.25 million. SS assessors determined the purity of German heritage for immigrants based on crude physical standards and personal questioning. Then they were settled accordingly. Another group subjected to racial screening were Poles. Starting in 1940, the SS began compiling German peoples lists across regions, assessing whether a Pole could be Germanized based on ethnic language, religion, and other criteria. Qualified Poles were registered on the German peoples list as pro-Nazi Germans or Germans affected by Polish influence, and they wouldn't be deported. Similar to immigrants, the screening standards were crude in the general government. In some areas, even 80% of the local population was listed as German, but in reality, they were Poles. In contrast, cultural Germanization was much stricter. For example, in the Warthland region of western Poland, towns and villages were required to use German names.
Polish schools, theaters, museums, newspapers, and other cultural institutions were shut down, and even the Catholic Church became illegal.
The music of renowned Polish composer Chopin was banned. Nazi racial policies in Poland gained approval from some Germans. For instance, in Warthland, there was a crematorium in the medical school basement. After shooting Poles, the German secret police would take the bodies to the crematorium to be burned at night. And
a German medical professor who moved to Warthland not only had no objection, but even said it would be good if the entire Polish society could be reduced to ashes.
Many Germans firmly believed they were the master race, and Poles were destined to be slaves. Under Nazi racist incitement, this prejudice finally turned into cruel atrocities. However, in the eyes of Nazi leadership, Poland was merely a testing ground for their racist expansion in the East. The ultimate goal of Nazi Germany was to implement the General Plan Ost across Eastern Europe, which will be the focus of the next part. In 1941, after a series of victories on the Western Front, Germany shifted its attention to Soviet-controlled Eastern Europe. Hitler fantasized about turning this area into a German exclusive colony and planned to have millions of Germans replace the Slavic peoples living there within 100 years. So, for this purpose, Nazi leadership drafted a hunger plan alongside military plans for invading the Soviet Union. The hunger plan stated that all grain from conquered Soviet territories would be used to supply German forces. Meanwhile, millions of local Soviet residents would be systematically starved to death. Building on this, SS leader Himmler began formulating the General Plan Ost in June 1941. This was a systematic plan for German colonization of Eastern Europe. The plan was divided into two phases, with the first being the destruction phase. Germany planned to expel 45 million Poles, Ukrainians, and Russians from Eastern Europe within 20 years, or let them die from disease and malnutrition. The earlier hunger plan was a key component of this phase. Then, General Plan Ost entered its second phase, the construction phase. Germany would formally annex these emptied lands for 10 million German settlers. Germany would invest 67 billion Reichsmarks to build large-scale modern towns and industrial centers there. This investment accounted for 2/3 of Germany's GDP in 1941. Sober, emphasizing scale, was unprecedented in human history. The first phase was essentially an escalated version of Germany's dismantling of Poland, but far more extreme. In Hitler and the Nazi Party's view, Poles were merely subhuman, while Communist Soviet Union posed a direct threat to Germany. Therefore, Hitler's hostility toward the Soviet Union far exceeded that toward Poland. He bundled anti-communist ideology with racism, viewing the impending Soviet-German war as a racial struggle, demanding unprecedented brutality from German forces. On June 22, 1941, the Soviet-German War erupted. In its early stages, German forces advanced rapidly. The Soviet Union not only lost vast territories but also saw large numbers of soldiers and civilians captured. In the war's first weeks, many prisoners of war were executed immediately by German troops, while others were handed to the SS and sent to concentration camps. The Minsk concentration camp was one such facility. In July 1941, this camp held 100,000 prisoners of war and 40,000 civilians, nearly Minsk's entire male population. Prisoners were confined in a square, packed so tightly they couldn't move, forced to relieve themselves where they stood. They had no food. Some hadn't eaten for a week. Local residents trying to provide food were stopped by German soldiers. Some prisoners of war were sent to concentration camps in Poland, where inmates were used as practice targets. Now, German soldiers also set dogs on them to chase them, betting on which dog could inflict the most severe trauma on the prisoners. Due to insufficient food supplies, prisoners were starving, and when one prisoner died, the others would immediately pounce on the corpse to devour it. They were covered in fleas. Infectious diseases spread in the camps, and prisoners had no clothing to protect against the bitter cold. Of the initial 80,000 prisoners in this camp, only 3,000 survived. Guided by racism, the plan to starve Soviet people became a reality. It wasn't until the end of October 1941 that the Germans realized they could use Soviet captives as forced labor, and Germany's policy towards Soviet POWs changed. During the Soviet-German War, the German army captured about 5.7 million Soviet POWs. By the war's end, 3.3 million had died, accounting for 58% of the total, and the actual number may be higher. In comparison, the mortality rate for British, French, and other POWs captured by Germany was less than 2%.
The mass deaths of Soviet POWs were directly caused by Nazi racist ideology.
This racial ideology received overwhelming support among German officers. It can be said that starving and abusing Soviet POWs to death in batches was Nazi Germany's execution of the first phase of the General Plan Ost. That concludes the second part. Next, I'll tell you about the internationalization of the plan to exterminate Jews in the third part. Among all the racist atrocities of Nazi Germany, the most infamous one is the plan to exterminate Jews.
When mentioning this plan, you might think of Auschwitz concentration camp,
Gas chambers, or even Schindler's List. But you might not realize that exterminating Jews in Nazi-controlled Europe was no longer just a German act abroad, but an international one. In January 1942, 15 senior Nazi officials gathered at the 1C Villa for a conference, where representatives clearly stated that all Jews in Europe would be exterminated. After the meeting, Propaganda Minister Goebbels pointed out that the Jewish question must now be solved on a pan-European scale. Hitler himself took the stage, delivering a speech at the Reichstag, pushing anti-Semitic rhetoric to its peak. German administrative authorities in occupied countries and representatives in vassal states and allied nations began implementing the plan to exterminate Jews in these places. In this regard, France is a prime example, with its deeply rooted tradition of anti-Semitism. As early as the 1890s, Jewish officer Alfred Dreyfus was accused of being a German spy. In the 1930s, pressured by Hitler's racial policies, approximately 55,000 Jewish refugees fled from Central Europe to France. However, French authorities actually suspected these Jews of being spies loyal to Germany.
subjected to discrimination in France. After France's defeat, many citizens believed Jews were the primary culprits.
In June 1940, France surrendered to Germany, establishing Vichy France, with Philippe Pétain as its leader. Mainland France was divided. The north and west directly occupied by Germany. The southeast was directly governed by Vichy France under the name Free Zone. Vichy France was a highly developed fascist regime that collaborated with Germany, naturally including the Jewish extermination plan. Initially, Vichy France only persecuted foreign Jews residing in France. In July 1942, Vichy France launched a large-scale operation to arrest stateless Jews. Initially, 13,000 Jews were arrested, some detained at the Drancy internment camp in France. There, these Jews stayed 3 to 6 days, with only 1 or 2 bowls of soup per day as food. No water, no toilets, no bedding, with temperatures reaching 37 degrees Celsius or higher. These stateless Jews were eventually sent to Auschwitz.
By year's end, Vichy France sent 42,500 Jews to Auschwitz in this operation, including 2-year-olds who were immediately gassed upon arrival.
Regarding Vichy France's expulsion of foreign Jews, French native Jews, especially leadership, did not intervene.
However, as most foreign Jews were deported, Germans turned attention to France's native Jews.
In November 1942, German troops entered Vichy's Free Zone, fully occupying France. Most native Jewish leaders were arrested by the Gestapo and deported to Auschwitz. Fortunately, French citizens extended help, allowing 30,000 Jews to escape death. Nevertheless, during World War II, about 80,000 of France's 350,000 Jews were killed, nearly a quarter of the total. In the Nazi-dominated New European Order, compared to countries like Denmark and Italy, with significant autonomy, the persecution rate of Jews in France was shockingly high, and Jews in French colonies couldn't escape their fate. Morocco and Algeria were part of Vichy France. As soon as the Vichy government was established in North African colonies, 1,500 Jews serving in the French Foreign Legion were dismissed. They were imprisoned in labor camps and forced to build a railway across the Sahara Desert under extreme conditions. Vichy France's actions against Jews were just a microcosm. Under Nazi Germany's manipulation, this brutal racial massacre occurred throughout Europe. In Belgium, 40% of Jews were massacred by Nazis. In the Netherlands, the rate reached 70%, with 102,000 out of 340,000 Jews perishing. And so, in just one Greek city, 45,000 out of 50,000 Jewish residents were sent to Auschwitz. Statistics show that during World War II, at least 5.5 million Jews were deliberately killed by Nazis and their allies through various methods. Why did Nazi Germany implement such extreme genocide policies to eliminate Jews internationally? The author argues Nazis had an obsessive ideology, viewing Jews as posing real threats to Germany in all aspects. This ideology imagined Jews in Central or Eastern Europe, Britain, and America would conspire to wage war against Nazi Germany. Thus, only by eliminating Jews could Germans gain Lebensraum, living space.
It was under this anti-Semitic ideology that Hitler and Nazi Germany implemented genocide policies.
That concludes the third part. Next, I'll cover the fourth part. Systematic executions. In Hitler's view, people with hereditary mental illnesses and disabilities negatively impacted Germany's racial health. To counter this, as early as 1933, Nazi Germany implemented a sterilization policy. Any German deemed to have hereditary defects was subjected to forced sterilization. By 1939, when WWII began, 360,000 people had been forcibly sterilized. However, Hitler's ultimate goal was to legally execute them outright. In 1939, this opportunity finally arrived. The father of a baby boy wrote to Hitler. The letter stated that the boy was born missing one leg and part of his arms. The father wanted a doctor to kill him, but the doctor refused. The reason was that the doctor would face murder charges. After receiving the letter in July that year, Hitler sent his personal doctor, Brandt, to contact the father and instructed Brandt to personally kill the boy. After the Eagle incident, Hitler began systematically executing disabled Germans. He planned to kill 70,000 such people, believing it was urgently needed to purify the German race. And that was the fear of the death. This killing plan was called Action T4, managed by the Action T4 office, directly under the Führer's chancellery. To execute the plan, Hitler personally issued written orders. Initially, the targets of Action T4 were children with congenital deformities. Newborns were registered, and doctors and midwives received a reward of 2 Reichsmarks for reporting each deformed newborn. These registration materials were submitted to doctors working at the Führer's chancellery, who decided which child would be killed based on the materials. These children were ultimately sent to pediatric clinics to be executed. Initially, there were only 4 such clinics, but later many more were built, eventually totaling 30. Disabled children previously cared for at home by their parents also could not escape. Parents were told that their children would be transferred to special clinics for treatment and would receive excellent care. After September 1941, these home-cared disabled children were forcibly taken away. They were confined in shelters located in remote areas, where emaciated children wept softly everywhere. Nazi workers gradually reduced the food rations for these children until they starved to death. For other children, excessive sedatives were added to their food. Days later, they developed breathing problems and eventually died from bronchitis or pneumonia. But the doctors did not treat their illnesses. Instead, they injected them with lethal doses of morphine. According to statistics, during Nazi rule in Germany, a total of 5,000 children were killed, and the age limit for victims was continuously raised. Initially set at 8 years old, it gradually increased to over 16 and eventually expanded to include adults. After expanding the killing scope, the T4 office clearly defined the range of defective people, including chronically ill patients, mentally ill individuals, syphilis patients, the intellectually disabled, and even the elderly. As required, psychiatric hospitals and disability institutions nationwide had to report details of these defective people to the T4 office using registration forms, which were then evaluated by medical experts and officials. Typically, these experts or officials worked part-time, sometimes evaluating over 120 people per day, with some experts having just seconds to decide a patient's fate. One selected the most common method was sending them to gas chambers. For a long time, the Nazis had been searching for faster and more concealed killing methods. Hitler's physician Brandt suggested using carbon monoxide for killings. Inspired by this, SS officer Widman invented the notorious gas fan killing method. Following Widman's instructions, a sealed cell resembling a shower room was built in Brandenburg's old prison to deceive victims, with carbon monoxide pipes installed along the walls. It also had an airtight door with a small window for observation. A standard gas chamber. By December 1939, Posen near Brandenburg began using gas chambers to kill disabled people. While 8 patients were being killed by carbon monoxide, Nazi officials, T4 officers, and doctors took turns peering through the window. Widman controlled the gas flow while explaining how to determine the lethal dosage. This experiment proved gas chambers killed faster and more efficiently than lethal injections. Thereafter, gas chambers were built in numerous German hospitals to kill disabled people, a method later widely used in Jewish genocide. So, would these disabled people vanishing cause controversy? The answer is definitely yes. Action T4 itself was clandestine. Hitler attempted to legalize Action T4 through legislation, but ultimately abandoned the effort. Most participants knew they were committing illegal murder. Even fanatical Nazi officials used pseudonyms when handling T4 matters to evade responsibility. Despite the secrecy, this operation gradually drew German public attention, sparking scattered protests. Among these protest activities, the one that truly made an impact was the Bishop von Galen's sermon incident. Galen was a bishop in the German Catholic Church who actively pushed the church to stop Action T4, but the weak German church leadership kept compromising with the Nazi government. And out of disappointment, von Galen gave a long sermon on August 3, 1941, listing many facts and strongly condemning Action T4. Von Galen's sermon caused a huge sensation, and he also printed out the speech content. As an open letter from the bishop, it was read aloud in churches across dioceses. The British got a copy, broadcast parts on BBC German service, translated it into multiple languages, and printed leaflets. It spread in Germany, France, Netherlands, Poland, and other European regions, waking up many Germans' conscience. Numerous bishops stepped forward, risking concentration camp imprisonment to protest Action T4. Nurses and caregivers started deliberately blocking the registration process for disabled people. Friends, relatives, and neighbors of victims publicly voiced their worries and linked this killing to Nazi ideology. This was the strongest and widest-ranging resistance movement since Nazi Germany's founding. Due to overwhelming public opinion, Nazi leaders didn't dare take action against von Galen, pressured by the outcry. On August 24, 1941, Hitler ordered a halt to killing adults. However, this just drove the killings underground and slowed them down. In fact, until May 29, 1945, nearly a month after Germany surrendered, killings of mentally ill patients still happened, and the killing of disabled children never stopped for a moment. Hitler's preset target of killing 70,000 people in Action T4 was met long before defeat. The 4 aspects of the racist new order are now concluded here. Author Evans argues that Nazi atrocities against Poles, Soviets, Jews, and German disabled people weren't just war products, but followed an ideology of racial hatred and contempt, with many atrocities pre-planned before the war. In establishing Europe's racist new order, the younger generation of Germans was often the most radical and brutal. Under propaganda machine indoctrination, they were taught toughness, ruthlessness, cruelty, eagerness for violence, developing fierce hatred and contempt for Jews, Slavs, even disabled Germans.
They, inspired by Nazi Germany's central policies, they fanatically executed orders from Berlin, committing atrocity after unspeakable atrocity.
So how long could such an extreme, inhuman order last? Where did the Third Reich's road of frenzy ultimately lead? We'll explore these questions next time. Well, that concludes part 1 of the Third Reich at War. Reading notes are below the audio. Until next episode,